everybody to this Friday installment of the Finance Theory. It's a pleasure having Melissa Houscamp with us today. Melissa graduated from the University of Florida. I didn't ask why. I'm supposed to ask ladies how old they are. Graduated from the University of Florida, and after she graduated, she worked project finance for the World Bank in Washington, D.C., and then went to J.P. Morgan in their public finance municipal bond group, and was vice president. So she worked with Nate Johnson and people like that. Nate is selling hurricane bonds, and Melissa's moved on to now financing windmills in St. Kitts. A lot more fun and interesting. And she left J.P. Morgan and now works for MAS Energy Development in Jacksonville. So she wants to take questions often. I think she even has monetary rewards for questions. Thank you, Melissa.
Thanks so much. I'm really excited to be here today, and thanks for the introduction. One thing I'll tell you off the bat about me is that I'm not above cheap gimmicks to get people to interact. Oops. Do I have limitations on where I need to stand, I guess? I'm not above cheap gimmicks, so I do have a pile of candies here. And every time somebody asks a question, I'm going to toss you a chocolate. In other words, ask questions often, offer your viewpoints. I'm very interested in making this interactive. And thanks for the good introduction. I just thought I'd give a little more background on how I ended up where I ended up. I started, when I was in college, I had a part-time job with the Public Utility Research Center. And with that part-time job, the purpose of the job was to buy my ramen noodles. I never imagined that I'd end up 12 years later still working in utilities. But it sparked my interest in working in the energy sector. And from there, I moved to the World Bank in Washington, D.C. And at the World Bank, I was researching private sector opportunities in getting involved in infrastructure industries in developing countries. It was an eye-opening experience for sure. In my work at the World Bank, I was introduced to the idea of private sector involvement in infrastructure industries, but in contexts that were unrelatable to me as somebody who was born and raised in the United States. Just as one example, we looked at getting the private sector involved in tanker trucks for water delivery, because these were in areas of communities where there was no clean water service. And so there were tanker trucks that were brought in, and people would bring their buckets up to the tanker truck to get their clean water for the day. And that was considered a creative way for the private sector to get involved in infrastructure, but it was a way that's hard for me to imagine with somebody who just turns on the faucet and doesn't much think about where it comes from before that. After I worked at the World Bank, I worked for them on a one-year contract doing a specific research assignment, and moved from there to New York to work as an investment banker at J.P. Morgan. And you all are pretty familiar with the group that I was in, the public finance group, because of the two guys who were here last week. I actually worked with Nate in the public finance group, but I focused on energy transactions. So my clients were all municipal utilities, and toward the end of my stay at J.P. Morgan, I was a specialist in structured energy finance transactions. So I worked on, I'm just going to describe them briefly since I think we're all finance geeks in the room. I worked on energy prepayment transactions, where J.P. Morgan was a principal in those transactions, and what we would do is supply physical energy, so physical natural gas or physical electricity, to a municipal off-taker for a period of time, usually 10 or 15 years. In exchange for that, we would be prepaid for that physical commodity, and the prepayment would be financed using tax-exempt bonds. So energy prepayments were a way it was basically legal allowable arbitrage. So we would discount the commodities cash flow stream at a taxable discount rate that corresponded with J.P. Morgan's borrowing cost, and we would borrow money to finance that prepayment using tax-exempt bonds. So it's a pretty elegant way for a municipal utility to get a discount off of an energy stream that they would otherwise buy at market prices. In 2009, J.P. Morgan invited me, and I'll use invited in air quotes, to move back to New York. And I'd been out of New York for 4 or 5 years at that point, and was settled with my family, and so decided to decline their invitation. And that's how I ended up working with the company called Mass Energy, where I am today. I started doing some consulting work for them, and it just became a natural fit where my consulting turned into full-time consulting, which turned into becoming a principal at the company. Mass Energy develops renewable energy projects. So we're actually out there. We build the projects, we own them, we operate them. What we do on the finance side is we line up the entire capital structure for the project. So we look to attract equity partners to get involved with us when the project nears being shovel-ready, and debt partners to provide the leverage or the financing for the projects on a long-term basis.
Do you have a fund that you, or is it just the partner's money?
We're working with partners' money at this point. At some point, we'd like to establish a fund, but the market's been pretty challenging over the last couple of years for equity raising. So for specific projects, we've had a lot of success on that front. For a fund, I think the market's probably going to have to loosen up a bit more before people are going to start putting money into those vehicles. So I'm going to give an overview today of, if I can get my slides to switch. Okay, there we go. The renewable energy market. And really, what I'm going to talk about today is not whether I think we should be building renewable energy or whether I think some of the policies that are in place should be in place or are good ways for governments to regulate or spend money. What I'm going to focus on is looking at that landscape and looking at the economic opportunities that are created, where the business opportunities are. And then I'll specifically talk about a case study of a project that we're in the midst of developing right now in the Caribbean. So what is renewable energy? And oh, it's much bigger up there. It's kind of small up here. These are just some sample technologies for renewable energy. And what I thought I would do is just work to provide some definition around some buzzwords that we hear in the media or from politicians around renewable energy. Renewable energy really deals with energy for which the fuel source is renewable. It's meant to replenish in a relatively short amount of time. And so a good way to think about that is, in the biomass sector, for example, if we can grow biomass, cut it down and burn it, it regrows relatively quickly. And so that's how we're defining renewable energy. Also generally produces clean energy. So I'll reserve comment on biomass in that context. But generally, renewable energy is considered to produce few pollutants. That's oops, I'm going to break your stuff up here. As distinct from sustainable energy. And most renewable energy is sustainable, but sustainable energy, I get a kick out of this definition. Sustainable energy is energy from fuel sources that are unlikely to be depleted in the time context of the human race. In other words, humans could cease to exist when this energy resource is depleted, and so we consider that to be sustainable because, frankly, after we cease to exist, we don't much care who produces electricity out of what. And so the big difference between renewable and sustainable is a broader buzzword that includes technology generally, like nuclear technology, or looking at energy efficiency, which is really just getting more bang for your buck out of specific fuel supplies. So now you're armed with some definition around some buzzword technologies. So what really drives renewable energy development? I'm going to borrow a whiteboard up here. This is where the chocolates come into play, by the way. And no need to raise your hand. Feel free to just shout stuff out. So I'm going to ask a couple of questions. If GRU, I assume a fair amount of you are GRU ratepayers. Let's say GRU said to you, you could pay $10 more a month, every month for electricity, and in exchange for that, every single electron that goes to your home will be from a green energy source. How many people in the room would be willing to pay extra to have only renewable energy? Okay, that's great. That's a lot of you. So of the people who raised their hands for that, why? What drives that? And just throw out some ideas.
Do you mean every single electron, or just displace that? Because they can't direct green energy.
This is a hypothetical world in which I can direct green energy to you without mixing it with other electrons.
I want economists to be practical, sorry.
So if you raised your hand, why? What is it about having green energy that makes you willing to pay more for it? Go ahead.
Is it like a charity? I got the same feel.
Okay, yeah, you feel good about it. Oop. Hopefully I'm not going to hit somebody on the head there. Okay. What else?
Good for the environment.
And when you say, who said good for the environment? We'll test my throwing skills here. When you say good for the environment, what do you mean by that? Do you mean, are you worried about the pollutants that are coming out of power plants, or are you worried about global warming?
Well, even stuff like the VPOs, what we're going for energy like that way, it's destroying the Oh, Gulf Coast.
Okay. Sure. Let's add prevention of fossil fuel messes. What else?
Presumably, it prevents the export of capital to fossil fuel producing countries like Saudi Arabia.
Okay. That's a great one. How about keeps capital at home?
I think it's like some sort of like economies of scale there, when you need $10 and you're doing your part to go green, instead of going out and doing all the research yourself.
Okay. So you're saying it's cheaper to, you can have a greater environmental impact by pooling with your neighbors than you would by trying to do stuff on your own? Okay. Any other ideas?
Will the extra $10 fund future research and make it cheaper than $10?
Let's say, sure, yes. Well, and you could argue that even if the $10 doesn't specifically fund research, what it does is it encourages market development at renewables. So even if it's not direct dollars into research, it could encourage R&D to happen because there's demand for renewables. So.
With that research that you just mentioned, wouldn't that create more jobs?
Jobs. Underlining that one. I think I'm behind on my candy tossing. Okay, what else?
I know that a lot of people that drive Priuses and stuff kind of feel cool, so feel good / cool, really.
Okay.
So, just in case I'm trying to go into politics someday.
Okay. You know what's interesting is we've heard a lot of great ideas with respect to what motivates renewable energy development in the United States. I'm kind of surprised nobody's mentioned reducing our dependence on foreign oil or on imported fossil fuels, because that's one that usually comes up in these presentations. But now imagine you're in a developing country, and your neighbors are all pretty poor, and your electricity costs a lot and isn't particularly reliable. And I'm just going to say you're probably not willing to pay more than your already expensive electricity to have renewable energy resources. So in that situation, why might you want to develop renewable energy?
You mentioned being involved in a project in St. Kitts,
Mm-hmm.
and I doubt that St. Kitts has the money to invest, say, an $800 million nuclear station. Or I imagine that, for example, a wind farm would be much cheaper for them, and they have much lower electricity demands. So they wouldn't need to, for example, burn coal, they wouldn't be able to afford a generation.
Okay. So you're saying renewable energy could represent a lower cost to them. Is that right?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I keep missing you.
That they can actually afford.
Okay. That's great. That's a big driver. In markets where, and particularly in markets where oil is the price-setting mechanism for power, often renewable energy can cost less. What else?
You mentioned that it's inefficient and they're paying a lot for it anyway, right?
Uh-huh.
So if they're going to pay a lot for the renewable energy, at least maybe if they create a new infrastructure, it can actually be efficient and be renewable.
Yes.
Well, and that would also decrease their dependency on others.
Okay. Okay. Any other things you can think of?
Reduce the political scrutiny of those countries.
I'm sorry, say that again?
will reduce the political scrutiny of those countries. So,
Okay.
Like reducing their rainforests.
Okay, and making them look more environmentally friendly for political reasons?
Yeah.
Okay. And with that, I think just to add on to that thought, I think there are some tourism benefits that come along with that. If you can advertise yourself as being green, then both politically and from a tourism perspective, you can probably attract some more capital into your country.
I feel like it could create jobs and stimulate the economy.
That's a great one. So you can see the drivers between developing renewable energy in the United States and developing new renewable energy in developing countries are somewhat different. They're both economically driven, but in the United States, it's much more about having a commitment to being green, jobs, keeping money at home, and things that are less related to actually saving money or making the grid more reliable. In developing countries, it's really more about meeting basic needs and making the grid more reliable and less expensive. This slide, if it advances. Sure.
Have you seen a trend as far as developing countries towards renewable energy, even if they don't really have such a strong structure for oil as it is? Like, for example, a country whose energy source is no good to begin with. Do you see them trying to go for oil, which may be cheaper, or actually investing in developing sustainable and renewable?
It's an interesting question. I think it depends on where in the world you are and what your domestic resource supply looks like. I think in places in the world, and I'm particularly thinking of places in West Africa and the Middle East where they have pretty abundant supplies of fossil fuels, there's less of a motivation to develop renewable energy right now. But in places where they're relying solely on imports, there's a pretty big push to look at renewables.
I think that those developing countries just mentioned, such as the West African countries, the Middle Eastern countries, don't really have the political leaders that are kind of either progressive or green in any way, that are maybe smart enough to even understand the economic implications of getting renewable energy, which might be a reason that they're holding back a little bit.
I think, and this is just my opinion, but I think the challenges in some of those markets relate to abundant supply of fossil fuel, which is relatively cheap. So it's hard on a cost comparison basis to make renewables look attractive, but it's also a problem with attracting capital in a lot of those areas. And particularly in some of the West African countries that I'm thinking of, it's attracting capital into those markets is challenging. Any other questions?
How much do you see, like, Americans, for example, or Europeans or developed nations, how much do you see that they want to invest in green energy in developing nations? Because, like, unless the benefits outweigh the costs, I can't see any institutional investors or anybody else wanting to put money over there just because it feels good. They may go out and spend, $30,000 when they could spend $20,000 on a Prius. But in the same regard, it's like, the people that are really going to make a difference are the people that are responsible for large amounts of money within, these developed nations. And, are they going to make the decision if their job's on the line, or if their reputation is to give this money to a developing country that may not have the political regulations and standards in place that the money is actually going to go for that purpose, and is going to be built up and be able to produce a return for that?
I think that's a great question, because at the end of the day, that's part of why this presentation doesn't focus on whether we should or should not be doing this, because at the end of the day, if I'm going to put my money at risk, or if I'm going to put a fund's money at risk, I'm going to do so in a way that I can mitigate as many of the risks as possible, and I'm going to achieve an appropriate risk-adjusted return. And if I don't have those two pieces in place, then I'm sure not going to go there with my capital, which is why some markets do have a really hard time attracting capital. The other piece that comes into play, and particularly in some more challenged markets, is the role of multilateral donor organizations and government organizations that can provide benefits or guarantees or insurance products that will help mitigate some of those risks in those markets. But absolutely, what it comes down to is a risk-adjusted rate of return. If I can get a better risk-adjusted rate of return here than I can abroad, then as good as I'll feel about putting money abroad, it's not a rational decision.
And what do you see as far as the future of that? Like political risks, I know it probably depends on country by country, but I mean, do you see it as being a growing thing, or do you think there's more development that has to be, more development of these particular technologies that has to come before it actually makes sense to lay out $800 million for a wind farm or something like that in India that, your money may be lost and you don't, what do you see as the future? And I guess it depends on the particular country and it depends on the particular energy source, right?
It does depend on both of those things. I think this concept of political risk is not going away. And so I think that, like I said, multilaterals and government-sponsored organizations are going to continue to play a good role in attracting capital into those countries. And just one example of that we'll talk about in a few minutes, but the Overseas Private Investment Corporation in the United States is a government-backed organization whose goal in life is to encourage private U.S. capital to be invested in developing countries. And so what they do in order to encourage that is they provide loan guarantees for projects in developing countries. They provide political risk insurance products. They'll provide some contractual risk insurance products. And they've got a whole host of things that fit within their mandate that allow capital to be deployed in some challenged regions. I don't think political risk is going away. I wish I could, give the beauty pageant queen speech of world peace, but it's just a reality. So I think what we try to do is figure out how to solve some of those market challenges, and where we can't solve them, we just don't go.
Because, you're taking huge risks even if you invest in this stuff in our country, correct?
You can mitigate a lot of those risks, and that's part of, what we're going to...
Political risks within the United States.
Yep, absolutely.
Who's in Washington and what, priorities they have.
Yeah, good example of that. Would you develop a biomass plant in the United States right now? I have a hard time doing that because of carbon risk.
Yeah.
And that's a great example of, even in the United States, there's not, you think of the United States as being the dreamland for mitigating political risk factors in a project, and it has its own set of risks.
You mentioned that one of the benefits of promoting, for example, renewable energy projects is producing local jobs. My understanding is that, especially, for example, in the case of wind farms, most of those jobs go to the countries that produce, for example, wind turbines. In this case, it would be mostly China. So is that really a benefit that you've noticed, especially in developing countries, that the countries are really focused on creating jobs domestically? I wouldn't expect a wind farm to create a lot of jobs.
And that's a great point. And it's in the case study that we're going to talk about in a few minutes, we're talking about a small island market where we're going to deploy Vestas turbines. The turbines are coming out of Spain. So in the manufacturing process, you're absolutely right. Those are jobs that are created in Spain. However, once we get to the island, we'll need to construct roads to get the turbines to the site where they're going to be erected. We're going to have construction jobs with respect to laying the foundations for the turbines themselves, erections of the tower. We're going to have the ongoing O&Ms. Contracting will include at least 3 people who will be physically on the island who will be trained by Vestas on a full-time basis. So it does, not only during the construction process, but also during the operations, it does create full-time jobs that are associated with the project.
I want to try to understand make sure I get this political risk as carefully as I can. So I'm going to invest in, I'm a private investor who will build something that generates power, windmills, whatever it is. Then I'm going to get paid back by the people who buy electricity.
Yes.
So the people who buy electricity is a political entity, it's a municipality, it's a government, it's a state, something like that.
Right, often, yep.
Often. So then so there might not be enough demand, so on and so forth, but it's really a matter of they could just decide not to pay you.
They could.
That's the political risk.
There's risk associated with non-payment under the contract. There's risk associated with this expropriation. They can just take it. There's risk associated with basically honoring the terms of a contract. And those are the key ones that I can think of. And those are all ones, and OPIC happens to be near and dear to my heart because I'm working with them right now. And those are all ones that OPIC provides insurance policies for in their key markets.
In the U.S., it's very different there. In the U.S., it's just that I might build something with the idea that I would get a stream of revenues from selling this property, from selling electricity, but I also might get carbon credits. I mean, who knows what the carbon credits. That's sort of political uncertainty as opposed to expropriation.
Yeah, I don't think expropriation is really a material risk in the United States, but I think carbon regulations are probably the biggest one when it comes to conventional energy sources in the U.S.
Would you include regulatory risk under political risk, or is that a separate one? And if the regulators don't let electricity prices rise to cover the costs, or they can decline in real terms, is that part of the risk factor you're looking at?
I think it absolutely is. Where I would put a footnote next to that is that typically in the projects that we structure, we look for long-term offtake agreements. So we've got 20-year power purchase agreements with prices set for 20 years. I'm sorry?
You've got a take or pay contract?
Take and pay, yeah, in this case. But yeah, so in that case, if for some reason there's a willy-nilly change in rates under that contract that doesn't allow them to comply with the contract, then that would be a breach of contract coverage rather than regulatory risk.
Well, Sandy, how would that be any different than electricity that was generated any other way? Those are still risks. Are they differential risks for this kind of energy?
No, I mean, the whole discussion of the developing world is basically this uncertainty of what the future is going to hold in terms of demand growth and political uncertainties and local and all of that. Just different in those countries. You need to give an advertisement for World Bank program at this point.
Yes, that's a great segue. The Public Utility Research Center co-sponsors a program with the World Bank that trains utility regulators in developing countries. So one of the things they focus on in that training is really what the best regulatory framework is and what some of the risks are associated with making changes in regulations on an ongoing basis. And it's a great program. The next slide talks about, it's basically a summary of the drivers that we've talked about, and there's some interesting things that I want to just pull out of this slide. What it does is it looks at a couple of different categories, and this was compiled from a survey of stakeholders from these different regions, but looks at the importance of climate change, environmental issues, energy security, reliability, and local economic development, and I would just put jobs in that category since that's come up as a recurrent theme. And what we can pull out of this is the biggest contrast is really between what's going on in Europe and the United States and what's going on in developing countries. In Europe, for example, the stakeholders in Europe are very driven by climate change issues, very driven by environmental issues, and not as driven by reliability or local economic development. You contrast that with what's going on in developing countries where although they have the same feel-good sentiments about green power that we do, it's not a driver for development. That works. It's not a driver for development, and really the key driver for drivers for development in developing countries are these concepts of contributing to the local economy and increasing reliability. So we've talked about the market drivers for development of renewable energy. I want to just take a minute to summarize some of the regulatory and policy frameworks that are in place. So we've got a complete backdrop to try to identify the business opportunities. In the United States, renewable energy development is primarily at this time driven by renewable portfolio standards, which we'll talk more about in a minute, but in summary, those RPSs are just state requirements to have a certain percentage of your electricity in that state from renewable resources. There are RPS targets that have been adopted by 29 different states. And those requirements are a big driver behind renewable energy in the United States right now. There are some other tools that are being used from a legislative perspective, such as feed-in tariffs and specific carve-outs for different technologies. Feed-in tariffs, I've got a page specifically on feed-in tariffs because I don't know, just as a show of hands, how many of you in the room have heard of feed-in tariffs? Okay, well good, I'm glad I've got a slide on it then. Feed-in tariffs is something that should be near and dear to all of your hearts because GRU is one of the very, very few utility systems in the United States that have actually used a feed-in tariff. In developing countries, what we've talked about is that renewable energy can actually displace higher cost energy. So we're not relying necessarily on subsidies to make energy cost effective, but attracting capital remains a challenge in those countries. I love this map. This is a map of what we talked about a minute ago of the RPS, of Renewable Portfolio Standards by state, and it gives a summary of kind of who's doing what, and then shows with little pictures of suns or water drops if there are specific carve-outs for different technologies. Now, just because your state's not highlighted in here doesn't mean that there's not renewable energy that's being developed. Can anybody think of why renewable energy might be being developed in states that are not highlighted, in the Southeast in particular? Sure.
Probably fairly cost effective. There's timber that's used for biomass and also solar energy. Those are things that are they're just happening without requirements, without mandates, without the RPS, right?
Yeah, that's a great point. There are some technologies that can be deployed that are actually cost effective, but the other big driver behind renewable energy development is really risk management. It's what if our state has an RPS and we're caught flat-footed? Well, then what do we do? Or what if there's federal regulation on carbon? Well, that would be a bummer if everything in the state is being generated from coal. And so that's some of the drivers behind what's going on in states that even though there haven't been RPSs adopted, there continue to be activity in the renewable energy development space. As promised, feed-in tariffs. Feed-in tariffs are a pretty powerful policy tool because what they do is they provide a guaranteed connection to the grid. They provide a fixed price for a long-term contract for offtake. And that price is, at least in theory, is based on the cost of generation. Gainesville Regional Utilities has one of the few feed-in tariffs in the country. And the way that works is their feed-in tariff is meant to encourage development of solar. So they have 4 megawatts set aside every year of new capacity where you can go sign up and go build your own solar farm and connect to the grid and sell it to GRU. And that's a carve-out. And they've got a rate that's associated with that. What they found in the first couple of years of deployment of this program is that it would get snatched up right away by all the developers. And so residential users who wanted to go put solar panels on their roof and participate in this were getting shut out because the 4 megawatts was already signed up for. So now they're talking about having a specific carve-out, I believe it's 200 kilowatts, just for residential and small developments. So if you wanted to take advantage of this program and wanted to build solar on your house, you could do that. There's a carve-out that's being contemplated, being put in place for small developments. Any questions on that? So just to summarize where we are in terms of opportunities, what we're looking at, and from a developer's perspective who's just trying to sift through business opportunities, what we're looking at is some targeted opportunities in the United States that are driven by renewable portfolio standards. There's also, it's probably worth talking for just a minute about, there's a grant program that was recently put in place as part of the Stimulus Act where renewable energy developers can apply for a grant, and in most cases it's 30% of the project cost that they'll receive after the project becomes commercial. And we have to start construction on those projects by the end of the year, so there's obviously a scramble to build things right now so that we can demonstrate substantial production or substantial construction of a physical nature before the end of the year. And for that reason, we think there's probably going to be a slowdown in projects coming online after that wave of projects come online. But that's driven by the grant program that's in the U.S. In terms of other markets, it's New Jersey, for example, has a solar program that's very favorable, so we are looking at solar opportunities in New Jersey. California has a very aggressive renewable portfolio standard, so we see prices that are offering attractive returns in California. But not a broad focus on trying to get projects done in the U.S. because there's so much competition here already and opportunities are limited. What we're seeing in developing countries is that if we can find markets where oil is the price-setting mechanism in those markets, electricity generally is pretty expensive. So we can go in and build renewables that offer lower cost, and in doing that, we're relying on third-party guarantors like we've talked about, like OPIC and Exim, to get some of that done. They have, in particularly if you look at smaller distribution markets, the interconnect process is much easier than it is in the U.S. In the U.S., we haven't talked much about this yet, but if you build an energy project, you can't just take a plug and plug it into the grid. As easy as that would seem and as obvious as that would seem, if everybody went and did that, we'd crash the grid. And so it creates these queues for interconnection to the grid that can be quite long and are cumbersome to get through. And we see fewer of those delays when we're developing in developing markets. Oh, that's a mouthful. Any questions on that?
Is that because in the developing country you also have to develop the transmission and permit the transmission to move the energy, and you can't in the U.S.?
It's a great question. It's I think what we found is that in smaller markets, we're really dealing with, they call it transmission system, we're really dealing with distribution size systems. And so we, in the St. Kitts project in particular, which we'll talk about in a minute, part of what we're doing on that project is providing some pretty significant upgrades to the transmission system that allow us to interconnect. So it's a little bit of a trade-off. We don't have a long interconnect process, but in exchange for that, we're kind of giving them something for free.
Don't you think the portfolio standards in the U.S. are meaningless without a revision of the national transmission grid?
Boy, that's...
You get that much power to the utilities that are required to build a portfolio because the transmission isn't there to...
Yeah, what's going on in the U.S. though, what's going on in the U.S. or what we're seeing in states like California in particular, which has a very aggressive RPS, is that what they're allowing utilities to do is just buy RECs to satisfy their RPS for now because of transmission constraints and just the physical constraints on building nearby. So I think...
This is the only state that's actually gone out and under a general levy bond built transmission to get wind to East Texas and West Texas.
Yeah. Yeah, and they still probably don't have enough transmission to get all the wind capacity out of there.
But they've got a solution. I mean, they're willing to take it away from the consumer, electric consumer, and put it on the general.
Yeah, I think developing transmission, there's a lot of projects that are being talked about in the United States and not a lot of action that's going into developing them because the returns aren't there. The regulatory process is very long to get transmission built. You have to worry about rights-of-way issues. It's a bit of a nightmare from a developer's perspective. But whether that materially limits the production of renewable energy to satisfy RPSs, I think probably depends a bit on the market that you're in and then whether or not you can use RECs to satisfy those.
How much is mass energy working in the U.S. relative to all developing countries? Are you doing projects?
No, we have two projects that are currently under construction in the United States. They're both landfill gas projects. One's in Georgia and one's in Florida.
So far, you've talked about political issues, engineering issues, public policy issues, and here's a group of finance students.
I'm getting there.
Before you get there, what did you find to be the most important contribution of a deep understanding of finance that makes you more effective as a deal maker or so? How do you take advantage of your finance expertise, background and understanding it's a special sector, it has all sorts of risks and uncertainties that you kind of outlined for us, and the finance concepts, I guess, which ones really matter the most to you?
I think that's a great question. I think there are two sets that I find to be the most important ones when evaluating projects. One is a solid understanding of credit risk and credit risk management. I think when you work in fixed income, and I think I remember hearing that most of you are taking fixed income now, is that right? When you work in fixed income, really what drives the interest rate on bonds is credit risk. It's credit risk, terms, other kind of bells and whistles you can put on it, but it's primarily credit risk. So if you have a solid understanding of credit risk, then you can look at not only will debt financing be available for these projects, if it is available, how much is it going to cost us? And what are some of the things we can do to either make it available or make it cost less? So I think that credit risk analysis has been important. The other piece the other skill set that's important is the financial modeling skill set. And I'm sure that all of you have drowned in discounted cash flow models, and that doesn't go away after you graduate. It's one of the things that we do, or that I do as part of energy development, is make sure to have a comprehensive financial picture of how this project is going to work. Which, getting back to the credit risk point, helps me pick out individual pieces that I can try to risk manage and get some certainty around, but also helps us sell these projects to our investor partners. It's not without having that sort of comprehensive and complete set of financials. I don't think we'd be able to do the projects that we've been able to do. This slide we've talked most about already. I'm going to point out the second bullet that's highlighted here, which goes back to the drivers behind looking at opportunities. Our look at opportunities is not just a static look at where we are today. It's a dynamic look about where we're going in the future. So the World Energy Outlook has this forecast that over the next 25 years, world energy consumption is going to increase by 60%, and almost all of that's going to be in developing countries. So if we're not looking hard at ways to attract investments into developing countries or ways to turn it around to me, be an investor in these projects in developing countries, we're missing the boat. Okay, are there any?
I kind of have a comment. Andy and I here are doing a project for one of our classes. It's basically investments in India. And so we have to look at a bunch of different things. But a couple of statistics that we found is there's 600 million people in India that are living without power and accessible to fresh water in an easy manner, right? And so I was wondering. I don't know. I guess I was.
It's a startling statistic. I can talk a little bit.
Kind of what are those the type of prospects that you guys are looking at?
That's a good question, and I'm going to talk for a minute while I'm thinking about the answer to that, because it's what we're hoping to do as a country or as a company is our goal is to be an independent power producer, but primarily in places that have an established electric grid. Okay. So as much as I'd like to say that our goal is to be out building new grid and serving the poorest segments of the population, it's just not where we can show an appropriate investor return for right now. That's not to say we wouldn't be doing that in the future, but I think for right now that's a challenging market to get into.
But that's still the long term would be an opportunity for growth.
Could be, sure. Yeah, great question.
One more question. Does the majority of mass energy's income come from a return on investment in the project, or does it come from the O&M and construction revenue?
It's a carried interest return on the project. I'm going to hit you.
Got hold your guy in the back.
I was just going to say, obviously as bad as the recession has been for the economy, a lot of stimulus has come out of it towards infrastructure and green development. And has that stimulus kind of kick-started, some investments, some capital infusion into mass energy and the things you're looking at? And as that stimulus goes away, do you think the amount of investment is sustainable?
I might turn the question around a little bit and just because I think the way we look at it is a little bit different. What the stimulus money has allowed us to do is construct projects where we need a lower price on the offtake to meet our investor return targets. So they're an easier sell in terms of lining up off-takers for the project than they would be without. In fact, without, it may not even be possible. So I think from that perspective, it has helped us to meet the appropriate investor returns for some of these projects. But I think we'll be able to attract investment by finding the right projects going forward that don't require the grant. Does that answer your question?
Yes. Well,
okay.
Just going off of that, as that stimulus goes away, you're going to have less projects that are going to be appealing. So you think just the development in the industry, worldview is just going to keep spurring investment? Or?
I think that's part of the reason why we're looking outside the United States at most of our new projects right now. But for ones that are in the United States, I think that when the grant expires at the end of the year, that's going to signal a market shift in terms of offtake prices. Otherwise, there won't be that much additional development. It's right now the developers that are building this year are relying on that grant money in order to come up with returns that make sense. So I think this is just my personal speculation. If these RPSs stay in place and there still is a commitment to renewables, that the offtake prices will likely go up because of the expiration of the grant. There's also, I'll talk about this a little bit because it's a little bit technical, financy, but I think it's important to understand with respect to the grant program. The purpose of the grant program was never meant to be permanent, and it was never meant to be a permanent subsidy to projects. What it was meant to do was bridge a gap where, is everybody familiar with tax equity? Okay, I'm going to give a quick definition of tax equity. What these projects, in addition to the cash flows that you'd normally see associated with the project, they generate tax credits. And so I'll use the wind tax credits as an example. The wind tax credits, wind offers a production tax credit that's over 10 years, and you get a tax credit for every megawatt hour of wind that you produce. And so what the market had done before everything melted down in 2007 was we relied on equity investors who had a big enough tax appetite in the United States, had a big enough tax liability that they could use those tax credits to offset their tax liability, and they were willing to pay up front for those. When the market sort of melted down in 2007, that market went away. It went away in a big way, and it went away suddenly. And so that's when renewable energy development really kind of screeched to a halt for a little while there because nobody knew what to do to fund the tax credits. So what the federal government did as part of the stimulus package was said, okay, we know the tax equity market's not there. Instead of taking tax credits on an ongoing basis, you can take 30% up front in the form of a grant, and we'll give you that money. And the idea is mathematically for them, it should make them relatively indifferent because they'd be losing out on the tax credit revenue anyway. So might as well give it to you in the form of a grant. So when that program goes away, I think the hope is that the tax equity market will be sufficiently revived that we'll be able to attract those investors back into these projects. It's come back a little bit, but so we'll wait and see what happens by the end of the year.
I know you mentioned credit risk as kind of a key driver in just deciding what countries you'd like to invest in and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
But I'd like to turn the question around and kind of see what your take is on the actual credit rating of the bonds from those countries rising or decreasing in regards to their motion towards progressive, both sustainable and renewable energy. So if they do invest in those projects, is there a pattern of their bond credit ratings going up because they have a less likely chance of defaulting because they're taking care of their future energy needs?
That's a great question. It's not a pattern that I've seen yet, but if I were sitting at Moody's, it's sure one that I'd be looking at. Because if I can show a situation where electricity costs less and is more reliable in a country, then that's definitely one of the factors that goes into a credit rating for a sovereign. So it's a great question.
With regards to projecting investor returns, say you have a project that the payback period is 10 years. You have the technology, you think technology will be cheaper in 3 years, but the payback period is going to be 5 years. How do you value and price that opportunity cost of waiting? Like if you think technology will be cheaper, more efficient in the future.
What we do is we look for long-term offtake agreements that allow us to meet our investor return targets. So what that does is isolates us from risk and changes of technology that would make that technology cheaper in the future. What it doesn't do is isolate us from, if we were in a situation, let's say we wanted to sell an asset in 5 to 7 years, which is a pretty typical life for a private equity investor. It leaves the risk with us of a significant change in that asset that's due to changes in technology that have come after it comes online. Does that answer your question? Okay. Any other questions on the market generally before we dive into a specific case study? These are all great questions. I'm excited to get into this. Okay, so what we're going to do for the next couple of minutes is pretend that we're all equity investors, and we're all going to take all the money in our bank accounts, and we're all going to put it in this project in St. Kitts. And so what we want to do, and I'll give a little bit of background on the project before we get into this, but be thinking as we're going through this background about what you would want to know about the risks associated with that project. If you're taking all your money in your bank account and putting it into St. Kitts, how do you know you're going to get your money back, and how do you know you're going to get a return? And what we can do, just based on the things we've talked about to date, to try to mitigate some of those risks. I want to talk just a little bit about wind energy in particular, because that's the technology that we're deploying there. Wind energy represents 1% of electric generating capacity worldwide, but in certain markets it's obviously much more than that. And in St. Kitts it's going to be about 25% once we're done with this project. One thing that's important to keep in mind about wind energy is that, this is going to be the most Captain Obvious statement that I can come up with, but wind doesn't blow all the time. Woohoo! Do I get a piece of chocolate for that one? So what we do is we calculate a capacity factor for wind, and all a capacity factor means is the amount of time you expect this asset to be generating versus the amount of time it could be generating if the wind blew 100% of the time. So we assign probabilities to this, and nobody panic who doesn't like statistics, because this is about the the simplest statistics that we can talk about. We assign probabilities to it. So what we call a P50 capacity factor means there's a 50% probability of it producing more than that, and there's a 50% probability of it producing less. In other words, that's what we expect it to produce. There's also a P99 capacity factor that we calculate. That means there is a 99% probability that the wind farm will produce at least that much, that level of capacity factor. So if we're following, which capacity factor would be the higher number of the two? Okay, great. Oh, yeah, I just put this in there because I like pretty pictures. This is a satellite picture of wind speeds worldwide. So what we do when we start talking about wind development and we sit down at the chalkboard and we don't have any projects in mind, is we look at where does the wind blow in the world, so we can start thinking about and overlaying the economic and political factors that we talked about earlier to figure out where the best opportunities are for development. So where does the wind blow the hardest? Well, in the middle of the ocean, so not that helpful. But we can use this map to look at opportunities that are onshore or near shore and overlay that with specific opportunities that are created by the markets to figure out where we're going to go. See, hopefully I have St. Kitts. Yeah. So this is where St. Kitts is located. Kind of overlay that on the other map, but it's pretty good wind, and in fact, it's better wind than we might have thought going into this. And what's interesting about this map, oh, there we go. St. Kitts is there. It's actually St. Kitts and Nevis. And what's interesting about this map is if you overlay a probability of hurricane strikes on top of this map, what we find is that the southeastern Caribbean, and it really cuts off right about here on that probability map, so just north of Nevis, is significantly lower probability for a major storm hitting their island than it is north of them in the Caribbean, which is great for us from an insurance perspective. Now, that said, probabilities, the weakness of probabilities is that they're just probabilities. So St. Kitts did, in fact, have two major storms hit in 1998 and 1999 that essentially wiped out the island. But so we're hopeful, since we got our two, that we will be relatively low probability going forward. A couple little factoids about St. Kitts. St. Kitts has a couple of titles to its name that it can boast about. It is the smallest sovereign country in the Americas by both landmass and by population. It's also the youngest sovereign country in the Americas. It gained independence in 1983 from Great Britain. And what's left, because of that, the relatively recent independence, is their political system is very much like that of the UK political system. So their laws very much resemble UK laws, which is a place that we're pretty comfortable. Oops, I'm on the wrong page. Their economy was dependent on sugar production until 2005. The federal government in St. Kitts had been subsidizing the sugar plantations for years and years and years, and they were bleeding money. And their national debt was going up and up and up. And so in 2005, they pulled the plug on the whole industry and shut it down. And so now that they've got all this great land on St. Kitts that was formerly used for sugar crops, that's now available for wind farms. Lucky us. The economy is currently highly dependent on tourism in terms of its market. And the other thing that's worth noting about St. Kitts is the population is about 50,000 now. It's a little under 50,000. It's actually a declining population. So in terms of exports from St. Kitts, they're exporting people, and primarily to the United States. They don't expect that to continue. They expect the population to increase with the development of some pretty significant tourist destination facilities on the island, but it has been decreasing over the past 20 years. Total electric load on the island is about 18 megawatts. Peak is about 25. So just to give you a sense for how big that market is, what did you say, Palatka? It's a very small electric market. Palatka's average electric load is probably about 18 megawatts. I put this oil price forecast up there to give you a sense for what they're up against. Right now, the only source of generation on the island is diesel. So they're importing oil, and they're over a barrel, so to speak, to oil prices. Nobody thinks I'm funny, man. Are you guys awake? And so what building alternate sources of generation does for St. Kitts is allows them to get out of this dependence on foreign oil and construct some assets that can reduce their imports of oil on the island. This is just some information about the project itself. We have authorization to build up to 20 megawatts on the island. Given their current load on the island, we're obviously not going to do that. We are going to put in 5.4, which is going to be 3 turbines. It's 3 turbines that are manufactured by Vestas. And the benefit to St. Kitts, depending on what oil price assumption you use, is up to a 70% reduction of their current electric costs. We're also funding construction of some upgrades to their grid system, which is going to make it more reliable, reduce their dependence on oil, and create some jobs on the island.
So that 70% reduction in power costs, would that amortize the cost of the blades and the turbines over time? How does that come up with that?
What we do is we're just looking at the power purchase agreement price versus what they could pay for oil. So what we've done to get to that 70% is looked at the oil price forecast over time, and that's increasing, which is going to increase the cost of generation on the island, and compared that to our power purchase agreement rates, which are relatively flat over time. That PPA is for 20 years.
I see. So that's not driven by the cost of your electricity per se. That's just what they're willing to agree to.
That's the difference between their cost of electricity and what they've agreed to from us. This gives you a sense for where the wind farm is going to be located. Basseterre is the capital of St. Kitts and is by far the most populous city on the island. That's down here. So by building up here, where the wind farm is going to be, we've got great wind in that location. We're not displacing any homes, so there's no people that are going to be displaced as a result of the project development. The topography makes a pretty good site for installation in terms of just the civil works requiring us to get there. I believe there are 8 cows that are going to have to find new grazing land. And that's all we're displacing on the island. The topography is something that's worth talking about for a second. This is a volcanic island. And so when you think about constructing a wind farm, and this has been a bit of a learning experience for me, but what you don't think about is every turn in the road, and on volcanic islands, I don't know how many of you have been to the Caribbean, but they're all kind of like this in terms of the roads, that there tend to be hairpin turns around some of the mountains that are on the island. And we've got blades that have, the diameter of these blades is 80 meters, and so each individual blade is 40 meters. So think about what that is in terms of a football field. Is that, what, a third of a football field? And that's straight and can't be bent. And so we have to figure out how to get it from the port to the site, which we've figured out how to do, but it's maybe not as obvious as you think. Yeah?
How many miles is it from this capital city to the location?
I don't know offhand. Sorry. But could you get an extra one for asking a question I don't know the answer to?
How did you figure out how to get it there?
We're going to have to build a new road. So. Sure.
First thing that came to mind when you said that was using helicopters. Did you guys ever
Helicopters are wildly expensive.
building a new road?
Yes. Yeah, there are only 2 providers in the entire Caribbean that provide helicopter service, and they're very expensive. So yes, we're looking at that. It's a backup plan, but hopefully not the plan. We put up our Met Tower to start measuring wind. Met Tower is a meteorological tower. It's just basically a big pole with a big computer thing on the top of it that measures wind speed. Started collecting data in February of 2009, and we're seeing wind speeds of greater than 8 meters per second, which probably doesn't mean much to any of you, but it means a lot to us because that's really fast. It's really good wind that's on the island. So our capacity factors for P50 and P99 are just off the charts for this project.
You said you don't want a hurricane. How fast? How fast can these guys sustain?
They're rated up to 55 meters per second, which is, somebody help me with that, 130 miles an hour? So if there's a wind speed above 130 miles an hour, then the warranty is void, and then we'd be relying on insurance. And assuming the blades don't fall off, and that would be a bad circumstance.
I'm just not a technical person at all, so let's say you capture a certain amount of energy, and theoretically, let's say that the windmill is destroyed the next day. Do you have the ability to put energy into reserves?
There's not. There are storage mechanisms that exist, but they're pretty expensive to build. So we're not building a storage system associated with this. If the turbines spin, we produce electricity, and if not, we don't. Okay, so oops. I forgot I had this in there, sorry. These are the major development activities that have to be completed before the project comes online. My personal favorite is the last one on here. After commercial operation, I do fully intend to sit on the beach and watch these turbines rotate because we'll be just very proud of having built our wind farm. But we talked a little bit about the various contracts that are required in order to get this project built.
Were there competitive groups that wanted also to build a wind farm and you had to compete with them? Or did they just accept, you came to them and they said, great idea, we'll go for it?
They entertained proposals from a couple groups, but there was no formal competitive process.
They were proposals for energy in general or wind?
Wind. Okay, so let's talk about, we've got a little background on the project. Let's pretend that we're equity investors and we're going to put money in the project. So as an equity investor, part of my job, just rewinding for a second, is to line up the capital structure for this project. So what I've got to do is go out and find equity investors who are comfortable with this project enough to put equity money into it, and also work with lenders on trying to get a project finance loan for the project. So as an equity investor,
how much does this project cost?
it's about $14.5 million.
For three?
I'm sorry?
For three?
For 5.4 megawatts, for 3 turbines, yes. Yeah, exactly. So if you're the equity investor in this project, what are some of the risks? Let's start with risks, and we'll get to mitigation strategies later. What are some of the things you're worried about? Why might you lose your money? There you go.
The country not paying or just
Okay.
falling apart?
Just so I know what the law is, but so the contract would be with the government of kits to buy a certain amount of electricity every day at a certain price. Is that what the contract looks like?
The contract is with the electricity department of the government of St. Kitts. So payments are guaranteed by the government of St. Kitts. And what they're required to do is buy every megawatt hour that we produce.
Oh, so you don't.
So they don't have to pay if we don't produce.
And they also, if you produce more than they need, they buy everything that you produce.
Yes.
Cool.
Yeah, that's part of the sizing of the project was a pretty significant hurdle with the government of St. Kitts, and that's one of the things they had to get comfortable with, was that we weren't going to install 20 megawatts and willy-nilly generate 20 megawatts of electricity when the average load on the island is only 18, and they would get stuck buying all this extra power. They got comfortable with 5.4 because they felt like that really corresponded well with the minimum amount of electricity they would need. But if their load falls below that and we produce that, then they have to take it.
There's a probability of mass energy going out of business.
Okay. I'd like to think that I rock and that's a low probability, but
I'd be concerned with the transportation of the turbines to the site because I've been to West Indies and those roads are about the size of one car. Definitely not 4 meters.
Let's see, I'll call this construction risk.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
You mentioned the contract that you're under with the country.
Mm-hmm.
Does that ever expire?
20 years.
So what happens after 20 years? They just get to keep the turbines, or are you taking them?
There's an optional extension on the contract. If they don't extend, then we have the option of taking the turbines off the island, but it would be at our expense.
So one of the risks could be that like the price of other energies go down, and wouldn't that make the country not want to?
Yes.
But are you guys looking at a time frame of 20 years?
No.
No.
No, that's a great mitigation strategy, in my opinion.
Is the equipment built to resist all types of erosion over time?
Oh, that's a good question. It's built far enough in on the island that erosion is probably not going to be an issue, but it may be from storms. So I'll put on here erosion damage. That's a good one. Let's see if we got all my major ones. Okay.
As an equity investor, we're not expecting any fixed payments every so often, right? The only gains that we make are just by appreciation of the project.
No, you're expecting distributions.
So how often?
Quarterly.
And those are significant in amount?
Yes.
Okay.
Is that a risk?
Well, the 20-year thing does make sense, because if you're comparing it to other 20-year securities, then you might want to compare like the payments and so forth. So.
It's how you treat terminal value becomes important. Yeah, that's great.
So there may be a production risk, like if the weather conditions change and we cannot produce that.
Well, if you're financing with debt and you miss an interest payment, does the bank get to seize the windmills? Or is that, do you know what I'm saying?
They have a lien on the asset. So if we default on the loan, they surely will own the asset.
Then,
Yep.
And then the equity investors would stop receiving a dividend.
They'd be wiped out. Yep.
So
So is default risk on the loan?
I was, you would want to leverage this.
Yeah, we're leveraging it 75-25. So I'm going to call this loan default risk, but I'm also going to talk about cash flow uncertainty or cash flow certainty.
I had a question about the production. So 5.4, you produce more than that, they either can buy it or don't have to?
We can't, by definition, we won't be able to produce more than 5.4 because that's the rated capacity of the asset. So if the wind blew constantly, we would produce 5.4. If the wind blew constantly at 8 meters per second, we would produce 5.4. We're likely, on average, going to be producing somewhere around half that.
Okay. And so what's the low end of how much y'all would be in trouble if it didn't produce?
The low end of how?
So if it, is there a threshold that once y'all produce that much, then you're...
Oh, sure. Yeah, by definition, we could go down to 0. So it's, yeah, somewhere between 0 and everything.
Oh, I just didn't know if you knew what it was.
Yeah, I do. That's part of when we talk about stress testing our cash flows, which we can talk about in a second, that's one of the ways we can get to some comfort on this loan default risk, is how bad does it really have to get before we're in danger of not meeting our fixed obligations, because then there's obviously nothing left over for investors.
So is that half the 5.4?
Do you remember when we talked about the probability factors for wind? It's the biggest use of the P99 probability factors is for banks. And what they want to see is sufficient loan coverage, even at P99, to meet your obligation and have a cushion. And so our production would have to fall below P99 before we're in trouble, or before there's a risk of default. We're debt financing 75%. Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Good or bad?
I mean, you must mean that there's just a lot of cash flow for this, right?
Yes.
So with a 99 percentile, you still have enough to cover debt service. That's what's the debt structure? Is it a sort of a self-amortizing thing over the life of the project?
It's equal principal payments for 18 years. It's sort of an unsophisticated debt structure that we're up against. So the debt obligation is declining over time.
P99 covers debt service for day one.
It does. Yeah, debt service plus O&M plus our administrative costs. What it doesn't cover, where we would get into trouble is, and trouble used loosely, is that if the asset really produced at P99, which again, there's only a 1% probability that it's worse than that, our investors would see almost nothing. So that's where the investor upside is built into the production.
That's the only real risk of the wind, right?
Yeah, there's a real risk of the wind not blowing or the wind blowing way too hard.
As an investor, an equity investor, you told me the life of the project was 20 years.
Mm-hmm.
Don't you think I would be maybe more likely to invest if I thought I could get some of the money that you'd make at the end of 20 years if you decide to go ahead and sell the windmills? You know what I mean?
Yes, yeah, and I'm not going to put this up here as a risk. I'll just tell you what we've done on that. As an equity investor, you have a majority ownership interest of the project, so if the project is divested at any point in time, you would see distributions associated with that. I think this is a pretty good list for us to work with. So let's talk about let's take a look at each of the items on this list and try to think about what we would do to mitigate these risks so that as an equity investor in this project, you're comfortable emptying your bank account and giving it to me. So let's talk about hurricane risk first, since that's a pretty scary risk when you're talking about building in the Caribbean. What are some things we might do to mitigate this hurricane risk?
Insurance.
Yes. That's the biggest mitigant here. Insurance is not available in all markets in the Caribbean. For example, it's pretty darn hard to get insurance right now in Haiti because of the seismic risk there, but insurance is available for St. Kitts, and that's partly because of where it's located in the Caribbean. So if we got in a situation where we were up against a Category 5 hurricane, we had a total loss of the facility, they would pay to rebuild the facility under the insurance policy. What about the risk of non-payment? If you've got a 20-year contract with the government of St. Kitts, what happens if they don't pay?
Guns and ammo?
Sure, I'll put that out there.
So can you get a bank to give St. Kitts a letter of credit or something like an international bank to guarantee St. Kitts?
That's a great thought, and that's almost exactly what we've decided to do on this risk. What we're doing is through OPIC, through the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, they have an insurance product where they will, it's called arbitration award insurance, and what it does is it ensures the outcome of an arbitration situation. So indirectly, you end up insuring your payments under the contract. Because if they don't pay, then our contract says we go to arbitration, and if we get awarded a positive outcome in our arbitration, then that's insured. What are some other things, if you're just analyzing your off-taker, what are some other things that you might think about in terms of getting comfortable with the credit risk here? We've been able to insure it in the case of St. Kitts, but what if we can't? Yeah. You can have collateral posting provisions, and usually what we see under these contracts is those kick in when there's downgrading below a certain threshold. So if they've got a public credit rating, then you could use the public credit rating as a threshold. Otherwise, there's some other type of financial threshold that could require collateral posting. That's a great suggestion. Let's move on to really? Let's move on to mass risk. As an equity investor in the project, how do you get comfortable that I'm not going to take all your money and run? Okay. Yeah, that's a good one. Is anybody thinking about going into private equity, by the way? Okay, so at least one person. It's what we've done under this is what we've enabled our equity investor partner to do is have an ownership structure in the ownership stake in the project, where if there's a significant default on our part, then they basically kick us out, and that's a pretty typical private equity investment structure in projects like this.
You have a stake in it as well.
We do, yeah. Okay. How do we mitigate construction risk? And this actually applies to projects not only in the Caribbean, but also in the United States. What's the best way to mitigate construction risk? Picking on you.
I don't know.
You worked for an EPC contractor, right?
Yeah.
Did they have a credit rating?
Oh, yeah, I didn't know what it was.
Okay.
I mean, you can get a construction manager, quality control manager, credit ratings, and everything.
I'm going to put quality control. The biggest thing we look for to mitigate construction risk is an EPC contractor with a contractor that carries a credit rating. So in this case, Vestas is going to be providing our EPC construction service. Vestas is a single A-rated multinational corporation. So if anything goes wrong with construction, it is their problem, and I get their balance sheet. And that's what we look for with all the projects that we develop, not just in the Caribbean. Okay, what if energy prices go down? As an equity investor, if you're concerned about energy prices going down and you've signed up for this 20-year contract investment, what might you look for in terms of your return to make you comfortable that you maybe don't care what happens to the asset value in the future. How about target returns are before the terminal, or before the termination of the PPA? Okay, erosion damage. I'm just going to add this insurance down here since that was really a storm-related risk. Production risk. If you're emptying your bank accounts today, are you comfortable that this wind farm is going to produce? And if you are, why?
Well, because of the towers that you put up that we've been tracking it for so long, I would assume that if you're comfortable doing the project, you should be comfortable investing in it.
Okay. Yeah, we've collected wind data. Typically, wind data for these projects, it requires a minimum of a year of collection of on-site data. We're up to about 18 months. So we're looking pretty good from that perspective. The other thing we do with respect to production risk is we look at a P50 return because that's what we're expecting. We stress it looking at P99, which we consider to be a worst case scenario. So if we're still afloat at P99, then we're pretty comfortable that we're okay from a production risk perspective. Can anybody read what I wrote here? Oh, cash flow certainty. Okay. With respect to loan default risk and cash flow certainty, the cash flow certainty comes out of having the power purchase agreement locked up, your O&M agreement locked up, and all these different contracts put in place from the beginning. So the only risk to the project really is the production risk that we talked about a few minutes ago. So congratulations, you are all now energy risk managers. The last slide that we've got, oops, uh-oh. Okay, these were some categories that I came up with on my own, and apparently it's going to take a long time to get them loaded. The last slide that's on here really just, it's more of a sales slide to the government of St. Kitts, which talks about, it breaks it down by day, how much money they would save by having this project online. It's, as with governments, most governments in the Caribbean, sometimes they need a little prodding to make them move a little more quickly. And so this illustrates to them just how much money they're talking about every day of delay when we were getting our contract signed. It also is a nice win for them in terms of politically being able to advertise how much money they would save over the course of the power purchase agreement.
If the population grows as fast as they think it'll grow with their new tourist attractions and whatnot, will 3 turbines still be enough to fill the needs of all those people?
They're going to meet their load growth needs through diesel generators until we can get more turbines online. Population growth would be great for us because then we'd be able to go in and build more phases, although they'll be financially independent of each other. One thing that would be interesting, is there any of you sailors? There's a development on St. Kitts that's called Christophe Harbor that has the potential to double the electric load on the island that's currently under construction. And I asked the sailing question because the largest marina in the Caribbean is now in St. Martin by a long shot, but nobody can get boat slips anymore there because it's so full. Christophe Harbor has the potential to be the largest marina in the Caribbean. So that could be a big win for the island. So knock on wood, hopefully we'll see some load growth and we'll keep building there.
I was actually sailing in the North Sea this year, and I saw in the Thames estuary they were using wind farms on the water. So actually it wasn't on land, they were just, it must have been a shallow section of water, but is that something y'all have done before or looked into?
It's not something that we have experience building, but it's certainly a viable resource.
How do you move this? You had maybe a question Dr. Berg was asking a while ago. What's the trick of winning this bid?
This wasn't a competitive bid process. This business was won through relationships with the government of St. Kitts. So it really was ongoing relationships with the government, and we have a partner that we're working with on this project who's a real estate developer. So it was through those real estate developments which have already been constructed on St. Kitts that they had the relationships there, and they sort of on a one-off basis asked us to get involved.
So you understand technology and decide whether it's viable, and then also you can arrange the financing.
Mm-hmm.
That was that question you asked earlier.
Who owns the land that these turbines are built on?
The government does. They're former sugar plantations.
So what's to prevent the utility from building another
money. The government of St. Kitts has a significant national debt problem, so they're borderline without the capacity to borrow anymore. So they just don't have the capital wherewithal to build something that's competing with us. We also now have a binding long-term contract with them, so even if they did build something, they'd still have to buy our power. Oh, I'm slacking on the chocolates.
If there is the need to build more, do you have some kind of agreement with them that you will be the ones to build it? Or
We do. We'll build up to 20 megawatts on the island.
so then you still don't have to worry about competition even when other people see that it's a profitable business.
Right. Yeah, I believe the government has the right to build their own generation on the island, but other independent power producers, we would get a right of first refusal on.
Now, when companies like Siemens and General Electric, they're more like the turbines, correct?
Yep.
And then you said Acosta, was it?
Vestas,
That's
which
what
is
you got.
it's a
You guys-
competitor of Siemens and GE.
Okay.
Yeah, GE doesn't actually build in the Caribbean,
Okay.
but Vestas is a big supplier to wind turbines in the Caribbean.
Okay.
This is, in terms of slides, by the way, this is the end of the presentation, so feel free to ask questions about anything and everything that we've talked about today.
With the 20-year contract, is that just a random long-term number, or is that how long it takes you to recoup the cost of building a turbine?
That's a typical contract length for projects of this type. We would have needed at least 18 years for the OPIC financing program that we qualified for.
I was in Antigua a couple of weeks ago, and I noticed something interesting there in that I noticed several wind turbines on the island, but unlike wind farms here in the U.S., where you might see 20 or 30 turbines in a row, I always noticed one individual turbine, for example, near the beach, near resorts, and then you drive 20 miles and you see another one. They were all independent of each other. And the thing that I immediately thought is they've been building them in different spots on the island in order to generate capacity where the capacity is needed. Now, I noticed your map here showed that you were going to build all 3 turbines basically in one spot on the northeast corner of the island. And I'm curious why you decided to do that. Because I'd expect that if you spread them out over the island, it would make building transmission easier and would also reduce the chances of catastrophic failure.
The reason for putting them together is related to the interconnection. It's if we only have to build one substation and one interconnect point, then we can use that the same assets for all 3 turbines.
And is there already transmission capacity in place to transmit that energy, for example, to the south side of the island or to the port, the marina speed built?
That's one of the upgrades that we're building. Right now, their transmission system is what's called a radial system. So it goes out from the capital and goes in branches around the island, but they don't actually join. So we're going to go ahead and join them to make it a ring system so that we can go in any direction, so we can put power anywhere on the island.
And if you do build, for example, a second phase, if you need to build marginal capacity, would you consider placing turbines in a different portion of the island?
Yes. Yeah, we sure would.
A few slides ago, you had technology risks. So how do you avoid, like a game-changing solar technology coming in where it's extremely accessible to everybody instead of these large turbines that are so costly, as opposed to something that will be 10 to 15 years down the road that will be.
And I hope that something comes along.
Something comes along,
but we're
the iPod of solar.
The iPod of solar. We have a long-term contract with the government, and they're required to take whatever we produce. And so we're protected. We're exposed to credit risk on the government, but we're protected from our decrease in load on the island.
I noticed you noted the discount rate and looking at your savings. That's for public relations purposes.
Yes.
On top of the number, but your own books have something very different in terms of the net present.
Yes, we don't look at gross dollars. This is only for public relations purposes.
What discount rate did you use off the record?
I'm being videotaped, so there's no off the record here.
They just can't afford to build this. I was looking at the savings. I know that's the savings. That's not really capital. I was trying to do the math, and this is $14 million. That's like single digit hundreds of dollars per St. Kittian, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, but they just don't have the ability to borrow that much.
It's a political problem for them right now to borrow any additional money because their single biggest financial problem at the government is their national debt. So if they were to borrow any more, even for something like this, it would be politically expensive for them to do so.
What
That's advantageous for you, is that the commitment.
Yeah, creates a good opportunity for us.
What's their like credit rating?
They don't have a public credit rating. If they did have a public credit rating, it probably would be somewhere around BB.
Does most of your lead generation for like investment opportunities like this come through relationships like the one that you have with St. Kitts, or do you have like an in-house team that just kind of researches? Because it seems like there's a significant amount of scientific knowledge or technical knowledge required in order to determine the feasibility of one of these projects. It's not like you can just kind of be like, oh, like this looks like a good spot to have a wind farm kind of thing.
There is a significant amount of technical knowledge that goes into it. Our research team is also our development team, is also our business team. We're a small developer. There are 3 of us. And so we do have an engineer that's on staff. So when we analyze projects, we probably pass on 99% of the projects that we look at. But the reason we end up passing is because he's got a test that he uses from an engineering perspective. I use a test from a financial perspective. Then if it doesn't pass both, then we pass.
Do a lot of people come to you with ideas?
Mm-hmm.
Since you're part of this team that obviously has some of the technical knowledge, what would be the range that these turbines can no longer provide energy for? You know what I mean? The radius? I mean, is there a certain distance after which they're no longer going to be effective in reaching out?
Oh, just because of line losses? In other words, how far can you transmit electricity?
Yeah.
We're not going to run into that problem on this island. This is a tiny island.
I'm talking more about the U.S. starting to do these, you mentioned.
Yeah, there are definitely regional constraints. Do you have any talking points on transmission constraints and line losses?
Distribution line losses are 6%. Transmission line losses depend on whether it's direct. And they've got some technologies that can bring that down.
Yeah, but we can't generate in Florida and ship to California.
But we used to regularly move power from Canada to Mexico.
But by wheeling?
Well,
We
put it in the grid.
We have 800 megs of transmission south from the interconnect, the Oregon border, into the California utilities.
Okay.
And that thing was full all the time. We made more money off the transmission line than we did off the service. So we're able to offer some lower rates. But so you can move it a long way. I mean, you have line loss, but there's ways to mitigate that. So, I mean, we could theoretically be moving wind power out of the Midwest to the East Coast if we had sufficient transmission to do it. And as a matter of fact, with some of the technologies they've developed up in Hydro-Quebec, you can control the transmission line loss reasonably well. And there are a lot of other technologies with smart grid that will enable us to even reduce that further.
Great, thank you. There you go. Yeah. Any other questions before we wrap up for the day? Thank you. Sure.
You mentioned that you work with the World Bank and, don't get me if I'm wrong, with JP Morgan also.
Yes, the right Morgan, yes.
Like, I mean, this seems like a niche kind of thing. How did you transition from the World Bank to JP Morgan and then to this eventually? Like, were you just, working at JP Morgan and somebody, like a friend of yours called you and said, hey, we're going to build a wind turbine?
Yeah, basically. Some of the work I did at JP Morgan was in the project finance space, so this wasn't totally foreign to me there, and did some structured energy transactions around renewables. So I sort of knew my way around the energy markets, but yeah, it was basically a friend of mine said, hey, you want to do this? And so we put a good team together, and we're out doing it.
But I mean, to go back to Dr. Burke's question, which is very important about what the finance brings to this problem. You have significant scientific understanding accumulated over your life on projects, electricity, and all that kind of stuff. But on the team that you're on, probably the biggest part of what you're doing is structuring the borrowing and that kind of aspect of it.
Yes, I spend probably half my day every day buried in a financial model. So the discounted cash flow models, yeah.
For a number of years, project finance is taking a cash flow generating asset and trying to structure debt to finance that. It's that repeated experience that you do part of what you, or a big part of your addition to this team.
Yes, Yeah, that's right. And it's also, there's a sales skill set that goes with that too in terms of attracting capital. So it's burying yourself in a financial model and then figuring out how to pull out exactly what we need to pull out to be able to attract investors. So are all of you ready to invest money in this? Did I do a good job?
Who bears the cost of constructing roads and stuff like that? Is it partially the government or is it you guys?
Nope, it's us.
And how do you guys determine the cost? Do you guys collect some part of the taxes from the people?
No, it's part of our PPA rate. The road that we're building is a dedicated road to construct on the site. So we'll get the cost of that out of the PPA rate.
I think a large portion of what we talked about was was about kind of municipalities and governments working with you. But something that stood out to me just in the thought of thinking about large energy consumption in kind of like a concentrated area. And you mentioned building it in LA maybe. Is it feasible to get a group of private investors such as maybe hotel and casino owners from like Las Vegas to put together a project in LA and have that as because they use tons of electricity. And
would they be located on the same site?
I mean, they would build it in LA because there's a lot of wind coming from the ocean. And then is it feasible to have all that energy go just straight from LA right to Vegas? And because that would save them a lot of money.
Yeah, I think it's funny. I haven't looked at transmission going from LA to the desert. I've looked at it going the other way. Yeah.
It's a net energy import, so you're not going to export it out of California.
They just the demand's in LA, so I don't think you'd set up. You wouldn't have a generating resource in LA and then send it someplace else because it's. Oh yeah, it's great wind in the desert. Yeah, there's the wind and the sun. Okay. Yep. But yeah, and there's certainly dedicated assets to specific facilities. It's one of the projects that we're working on right now is a cogeneration facility for an industrial user in Georgia. So what we're doing is taking gas out of a garbage dump. We're collecting the methane out of the garbage dump. We're piping it to an industrial site, and we've got a generator on site that's going to generate all the electricity that industrial user needs. Yeah.
I'm sure people have come out afterwards with questions, but.
Okay, well, thank you so much. I really appreciate all your time. It was great meeting you.